Hi everyone, I'm Ava, and today I want to talk to you about 5 everyday Dutch things that can be so confusing as an American. Now, some of you might know, I moved to the Netherlands from the US last year, and while my experience has been mostly overwhelmingly positive, there are some things that I struggle with. And today I wanted to share some things that are confusing. These things aren't necessarily a culture shock for me because I was aware of them before I moved. But I do find these things quite funny to experience on a daily basis because I feel like I'm really learning these things from scratch. Like, you remember when you were 13 or 12 and you were trying to figure out how the world worked and you were becoming an adult? I feel like I've been thrown back into that phase since I moved to the Netherlands. So while I'm loving my time here, there are some things that I definitely find confusing on a day-to-day basis that make everyday things just a little bit harder. Thing number 1 is when I go to cafes. Now, I love going to cafes. I talk about how much coffee I drink. I talk about how much I love coffee. It's a little bit of a thing bordering on obsession. But my obsession now has come with a price when I go to cafes here because there seem to be certain things that I just can't figure out. So there was one thing that I kind of caught on pretty quickly in the beginning, which is that you don't just wait for people to seat you. In the US, you go to a cafe, a restaurant, and you wait. Unless it's a really tiny coffee shop, the American one, you can pretty much expect that there will be someone there who shows you to your seat. Now, I really felt so awkward walking into cafes and just sitting down like I owned the place when I first moved here. And I still struggle with that a little bit because now with Corona, sometimes you do have to wait for people to seat you. And yes, there might be a sign indicating that, but not always. So this has been confusing. It's like I learned one thing and now I have to learn another thing, or rather relearn it. So when I go to a cafe, that's step 1. I have to figure out whether I'm waiting or going in. And I guess I have to be uncomfortable and go in. All fine. And when I get in, I sit down and I think, okay, struggles are over. Now it's time to enjoy some coffee. I realize, I should really get used to this by now, but that has not been the case. I realized to my dismay that I need to now figure out whether I go to the bar or I wait for someone to come to my table to take the order. And I mean, how do you guys figure this out? Because I see other people not struggling. They seamlessly walk in, take a seat, and then they just know what they're supposed to be doing. Whereas I'm sitting there like, okay, what do I do? And the funny thing is that sometimes I make a decision and I go with it. So sometimes I'll go to the bar and they'll be like, yes, we'll bring it to you. And other times people have actually been a little bit rude. But this was in Amsterdam, and I know that Amsterdam can be a little different, but they simply just looked at me dismissingly like, please, just sit down, we'll come to you. Please, we're doing our job. Don't come and bother us here at the table. And so the struggle continues. Now, you would think that the struggle would end there. No, it doesn't. The confusion continues for me. I am a very confused person when I live in the Netherlands. I wish I could tell you that I was better in the US. I was a little bit better, but now, being the awkward person that I am, living in a different country, this has just gotten so much worse for me. After I've, ordered something and I'm finally enjoying my coffee and book, which is my natural state of being, after some time, I want to leave. And then here comes the other dilemma. Do I wait for them to come to my table so that I could ask them for a check because that's what I'm used to back in the US? Or do I go to the bar? You might be thinking as a Dutch person, why don't you just go to the bar and then pay there? Well, as an American, that's very, very rude to do. You can't just go up to the bar and pay because people are going to think they didn't do a good job and they didn't come to you. While the sense that I get is that in most places you can go to the bar here in the Netherlands and kind of just pay, it's really rude as an American to do that. So I only moved here last year, so I still have not been able to get over this hurdle of just being more assertive and saying, take my money. Okay, now in relation to going out to eat comes number 2, tipping. I mean, I'm sure you guys were expecting this. So I know that Dutch people and Europeans at large find tipping in the US pretty strange. I get that. But the rules are really simple. You tip 18 to 20% when the service is good, normally. You can tip 15% on what you owe, but that's the absolute minimum you can tip if the service was pretty good and it wasn't terribly bad. That's the minimum you can tip. You tip 10% if the service was terrible and Yeah, that's how you let them know. Tipping $0, I mean, people do that, but it's not the norm. And okay, as I was saying this, I understand how you need to be an insider in order to figure this out. Also, you need to low-key be decent at basic math, which, on the spot, Americans do struggle with. We pull out our phones. There's an app for it too. Okay, so tipping in the US, pretty confusing. But tipping in the Netherlands, after you're used to this system, is even more confusing, because here I am with my 18 to 20%, and I know that's not right. But then I don't know what is right. So I'm still trying to figure this out, and I find it very confusing. It doesn't help because my partner, who is Dutch, has lived in the US with me for the last 5 years. So she has no idea what's going on either, because she's used to the American way. So we both feel really bad now for leaving a 5% tip. Okay, that's one struggle, but I really don't know how much you should be tipping. I've asked Dutch people about this, and they said a couple of euros is fine. Okay, but I feel like sometimes I'm still tipping too little, because let's say your bill ends up being 53 euros. Do I tip 55? That just seems like not enough money. Why don't you guys let me know in the comments? Let's take this example. If your bill is 53 euros, would you tip 55, and is that normal? That seems too little to me. And what if your bill was 100? What would you tip? Because I think I, at that point, maybe would do 105 and feel really, really bad about it. So let me know. The other thing that I should mention with tipping is that sometimes I inadvertently forget to tip. This used to happen more when I had just moved, because in the US, they come to your table, you give them your card, and then they go away. I know that's not what they do in the Netherlands and in Europe. They take your card away, and then they come back with a receipt where you fill out what tip you want to give. In your own, private little bubble at your table, you can fill in an amount that you want to tip. In the Netherlands, not so. They come and they stand there with the machine and they're like, all right, let's go. And then you need to tell them there that you want to up the amount. So if they tell you, okay, your total is 53 euros, you need to tell them then and there that you want to pay 55. So that is really strange to me and a bit confusing, because I forget. I always am waiting for that moment where they make it obvious that the tip should go there, but that doesn't happen. And so sometimes I forget to do that, and then I end up not tipping, and then I feel super awkward and confused, and I walk out and I'm like, man, should I go back in and order something else so that I could do it right? No, but you get what I'm trying to say. So moving right along to number 3, which is being a pedestrian here in the Netherlands. Okay, I am going to speak about this from my perspective in big cities, because that's where most of my experience here has been. But when I would visit Amsterdam when I was a tourist, so this is before I moved last year, this is starting about 4 years ago. And what I noticed immediately was that pedestrians no longer had the most right of way. In fact, bicycles were the king of the road. Now, to a Dutch person, this might seem like a no-brainer. I mean, don't you see all the bikes here? Like, what else were you expecting, you American? But okay, coming from the northeast of the US, especially cities like New York and Philadelphia, if you are on foot, the road is yours. People jaywalk all the time. Jaywalking is this very strange term for when you cross the street when you're not supposed to, because we have traffic lights everywhere, as in the Netherlands, and if you cross when it's red, that's jaywalking. If you cross when there's no traffic lights, also jaywalking. We jaywalk all the time because pedestrians can do whatever they want. I mean, if a vehicle bigger than us, including bikes, hit us, it is their fault automatically, because we are amazing, we do no wrong, we are on foot, and we can just walk around, no problem. Now, of course, don't get me wrong, I totally see the problem with that. But really in New York, where I'm from, people are just used to walking around wherever they want. It doesn't even matter. I've seen people walk into oncoming traffic and they're not even afraid because they know that the cars will stop. But in the Netherlands, that is just not the case. And I discovered this when I was in Amsterdam, and I found myself walking on this beautifully paved sidewalk. And then I realized that was a bicycle lane and a bike nearly ran into me. Okay, so the first thing that I learned from that experience is that, oh my God, those are bike lanes. I need to be aware of bike lanes at all times. And sometimes bike lanes are red. So it's a little easier to know which part of the street belongs to the bikes and which part belong to pedestrians. Okay, but in the US, what would happen is if I were on a bike lane or if I were trying to cross through a bike lane, it doesn't matter how close to me the bike is. I'm exaggerating a little bit because of course as a pedestrian you want to walk carefully. But let's say I was crossing the street and there were bikes coming. I wouldn't need to be afraid that a bike was going to hit me because in no world would it be my fault if any accident happened. So I would just be able to cross the street, no problem. But here in the Netherlands, the bikes on the bike lane are not watching out for you. And of course, this was my experience in Amsterdam. It's kind of the same in Utrecht where I live now. But the bikes will run you over if you were in their way. You know what? It's your fault. It's not the bike's fault because the bikes are just bikes and everyone here in the Netherlands is on a bike. So they want to make sure that they can continue being on their bikes and you need to get out of the way. It's like when Dutch people are on their bikes, they don't see people on foot, they see targets, so they're gonna hit you. Okay, so that was one part of it, but the other thing about being a pedestrian that's confusing, and you have to pay close attention here, because whenever I've tried to tell people about this, they seem to get a little confused. This applies mostly in Amsterdam where I've noticed. I haven't really noticed it here in Utrecht, but maybe there are a couple of traffic lights where this happens. So at a traffic light in the US, when you see a red person on the traffic light in the US and that person is blinking and there is a number underneath, it means that you have X amount of seconds to cross before it turns permanently red and it stops blinking. So that is the countdown to red. Now the converse is true in the Netherlands, where in Amsterdam especially, I've noticed they have these cute traffic lights with bicycles instead of people. So let's say there's this bicycle traffic light. Now, if it is a red bicycle that's blinking and there's a number underneath, that is the countdown to green. So it means that it's still very much red, which means that that is the amount of time you need to be waiting before you can go. So you know how long you need to be waiting, so maybe you're prevented from jaywalking because maybe if you're Dutch, you're super impatient. Whereas if you're American, you're probably also impatient when crossing the street, whatever. So that's the difference. Now where this gets confusing is if you're so used to one system like I am and you want to do the opposite. Now the funny thing is when my girlfriend came to the US, she would end up waiting for a really long time at traffic lights because it was blinking red and then it would turn permanently red. So then she would just wait and she would have this short period where she could actually cross the street when it was not red. Green, it's white in the US. So that was her problem. Now for me, it's actually a little bit dangerous because I would see this blinking red light, and I still do, and my first instinct is to cross when it's still blinking because that is a countdown until it's green, but it's not green yet, so I shouldn't be crossing. But I do, and I'm just gonna get hit by a car one of these days, or worse, a bike. Okay, moving on to number 4, measurements. Now, I know that Americans are weird in using the imperial system, but the metric system has been confusing for me, and that's just how it is. There are also certain other measurements that we use in the US that we don't have here. So starting with, of course, the obvious metric versus imperial. It's just that, you know, for me particularly, because I also lived in India for many years, I don't find it too difficult to understand what people are trying to say, even though that's not my first instinct, and I do get confused when it comes to kilometers versus miles, because I don't know, I just don't have a good sense of meters and kilometers anymore. So I still need to relearn that, and I still struggle with it. I still think in miles. I feel like my idioms don't even make sense in the metric system. I can't say walk a kilometer in someone's shoes, which you clever viewers pointed out to me in one of my videos where I said walk a mile in someone's shoes, and you pointed out that I should probably be saying kilometers. So yes, I'm even confused in my idioms. When it comes to Celsius and Fahrenheit, I have to say I am a strong Fahrenheit camper. Okay, maybe not strong. Strong sounds too strong. But I definitely think 100 degrees Fahrenheit when it's super warm just sounds warm. Whereas saying something like it is 34 degrees Celsius just doesn't sound that bad. And this is where I'm expecting all the Dutch people watching this, all the Europeans watching this, any user of the metric system to comment, but water boils at 100 degrees Celsius. Tell me you weren't thinking that. There are some measurements that I really miss, which is saying something like, oh, that store is only a couple blocks from here. I miss saying blocks. I know there are no blocks in the Netherlands, and I find that super cute that you guys have tiny little streets going like this. But it's something that I miss because a block is just so short to just indicate that something is just a couple of blocks away from here. So I miss saying that. I also miss baking with cups because a cup to me is just very intuitive and I'm not someone who does precise measurements, so I really enjoyed using cups and it was, like I said, just very intuitive. But having to follow these precise measurements just makes it a little too fiddly for me, so I definitely have to relearn that. And I never owned a weighing scale in my kitchen back in the US. Now I do, because how else am I gonna make anything? That said, for you Dutch people watching this, I learned about a special Dutch measurement, the pond, which sounds a lot like my beloved pound, but it is not. 2.2 pounds make a kilogram. But when you're talking about the Dutch ponds, that is half a kilogram is a pond. So that means that a pond is 1.1 pounds. That is confusing. That is so specifically Dutch. But you know what? It makes more sense because it's half a kilogram. Why don't we have 1 pound as being half a kilogram, I guess? But we don't. We just have our own thing. I do find that a fun, interesting Dutch fact, and I come across it in my Dutch textbooks. So that's where I have to think about it a little and be like, nope, it's not a pound. And then I often hear pond being said around me sometimes, and I don't know what they're referring to. So that's also a bit confusing. Do you guys still use the Dutch pond as a system? I'm curious. And finally, I wanted to tell you guys about number 5, which is standing in a line. And I am confused because Dutch people don't seem to like standing in a line. This is the Dutch people don't like to stand in a queue phenomenon, which is how non-Americans seem to refer to it. But let me tell you, Q is a letter of the alphabet. That's not how you say it. It's standing in a line. And Dutch people don't do that. Don't do either of those things. So I do find this very confusing because Americans like to line up a lot. Americans really like to line up even when there's no point to it. So it's very confusing to me to be in a culture where you don't line up. How do I know who got there first? Sometimes I go to the store and I stand in front of the cash register trying to form a line, but everyone around me just gathers, and they seem to be able to seamlessly keep track of who got there before them, who got there after them. I, on the other hand, am on my phone. I just want to be called when it's my turn. I just want to be waiting, chilling. So I find it very confusing when other people don't. So now I have to be vigilant, because if you don't know where your place is in line, people will go ahead of you. They're not going to wait to pay for your mistakes. That's something that I still find confusing because it is so against my nature to not line up. In order to understand this, you need to know that Americans like to line up even when it makes no sense. For instance, if you are going to take the Amtrak, the train, you need to wait until your train is called out or when they open the gates, and then you can go to your train down at the platform, which is how it typically works at many of these stations. So Americans like to line up so much that they will line up all around the station hall just to wait for their gate to open up. And then you will not believe this. Then oftentimes you get to the platform and the train isn't there. You're waiting for the train and everyone just disperses. So that line that you stood in made no sense, but people did it anyway. So that's how much Americans like to line. In New York, there is a professional line waiter. There is someone who will wait in line for you. That's how common it is. Here, I don't think Dutch people would wait in line very long. I mean, in COVID times, it's actually quite funny to see that people do need to wait in line, because otherwise you wouldn't be able to go into very many places that you need to, that are small and very cute, but small. So it is funny to see Dutch people lighting up, and sometimes, at least in the beginning, people were quite confused where they're like, wait, how does this work? Especially when there are multiple lines and they're like, does this count as one line? Does it count as multiple lines? What? Whereas to me, I'm in my natural habitat. I'm like, I love wasting time standing in lines. Of course I don't. It's just that I'm used to this other thing and it's quite confusing here. Anyway, those are my 5 things that I find confusing as an American here in the Netherlands. These are everyday Dutch things, but I'm still struggling with them just because of my different cultural experience.